Well, welcome to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Jack Canfield, and with me today is Barbe Chambliss, who's traveled the world for 30 years interviewing ordinary women who are doing extraordinary acts of peacemaking. And in her recent book, Women Peacemakers, What We Can Learn from Them, she shares the stories of 15 of these women, from an Israeli psychiatrist to a Zimbabwean orphan, and a paralyzed Olympic skier to an Irish nun. And Barbe is inviting you now as well to use these women's shared wisdom to do your own acts of peacemaking, and then email the story of doing that to her. We're going to talk about all that today. Welcome to the show, Barbe.
Thank you. Welcome to me too, and welcome to you.
Well, glad to have you here. Now, I've really been looking forward to this interview because I think what you're attempting to create in the world is so sorely needed right now. So let's start by talking about, what is your definition of the kind of peacemaking that you're writing about in your book?
Oh, good question. So there's lots of kinds of peacemaking out there. There's how to negotiate the end of a war. That's a kind of peacemaking. There's inner peace, but this is very different. After I interviewed these women, I realized that they are doing a kind of peacemaking that's very proactive. This is before people even know that they're being oppressed. They just know they're oppressed. They don't have any ideas why. So they're not ready to rebel. They're not ready to go out and have loud protests. This starts with one person who sees something out there in the world that doesn't feel just, doesn't feel right, and decides they're going to look into that and see if there's something they can do about that. So one way I do it is a visual thing with hands. So if you hold your hands out here like this, as if someone was going to pour clear water in them, this is my definition of peace. And that's because these hands are equal. And by that, I mean equal respect. So if one is up and one is down, I call that not peace, because there's a dominant and a subordinate element to the whole thing. So when I was interviewing people for this, I would go to someone from Ireland and say, if this is peace and this is not, do you know anyone that is making this happen? And I got lots and lots of nominations for women to interview. But the more I worked with these women, I realized that, how do I put it? They don't go out and do things for people. First of all, they go see if somebody wants to have a situation changed. And then what they do is they work with them instead of for them. One way to create a balance between this is to take the people who are on the suppressed side and go, but that is not sustainable kinds of peace. Or you can say, okay, I'm out here, I'm going to help. I'm going to pull these people up like this. And that doesn't work either, because it isn't respectful to them. If you were in their shoes, you wouldn't want to be pulled up. What you would want, this is a form of peacemaking that empowers other people to reach mutual respect themselves. So you don't do this and you don't do this. What these women did in their work over time was they did this. They work right with the person. Their modus operandi is respect. Because as the woman from Israel that I interviewed so briefly said, peace is synonymous with respect. Because when people respect each other, they're willing to share power. So this is not the kind of peacemaking that gets negotiated after a war or a genocide. This is the kind of peacemaking that makes war irrelevant in the long run.
So it sounds like an underlying premise is when there's an imbalance of power, that
Correct.
Ultimately leads to conflict.
Yes.
And if we can help resolve that, then the conflict doesn't have to happen. And then you have peace. You know, it's interesting. Right. One of my friends who I know you know as well is a woman named Lynn Twist, who works with the Pachamama Alliance. And when they first went to the rainforest to meet with the Achuar said, if you're here to help us, please go away. But if you're here because you realize that your future and our future are inextricably bound together, then stay and we'll work together. And I thought that was brilliant. And they said, exactly what happened. So that's really cool.
And Jack, let me just say that I even differentiate between a spontaneous act of peacemaking and a conscious. Can I talk about that a little bit?
Please do. Please do.
So an example I use is if, let's say you're a fifth grade kid. First of all, let me say spontaneous acts of peacemaking are happening all the time, everywhere. And the more, the better. But they're over when they're over. So pretend you're a fifth grade kid. You've stayed a little late in your class right before lunch. So you go get your lunch tray and you walk out and you're going to go sit with the other kids that you always sit with, popular kids. But that table's full. So you look around and see where there's an empty seat and you go sit over there and there's this quiet kid sitting there. And you strike up a conversation about the Olympics or something, but then you get up to go away because you want to get out and play basketball. But the kid says, "Thank you for coming to sit with me. Nobody's done that all year." And you go like, wow, that's why there was an empty seat here. And I think I do notice over here that there's a kid been sitting alone. That's a spontaneous act of peacemaking. The conscious act of peacemaking happens the next day when the kid walks out of the cafeteria and looks at where they want to sit, if that makes sense. It's thought about, it's designed, your intention is put there. If it gets rough, if you take on an act of peacemaking, a conscious act of peacemaking, and it gets rough, you stick with it, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Now, when you were interviewing these 15 women peacemakers for your book, I know you interviewed more. They didn't all make it in the book. I'm curious, what kind of questions did you ask them?
Well, part of this was driven by a PhD that I was doing in peacemaking at the Fielding Institute. And I had to okay the protocol with my committee. So I asked every woman the same thing. And the women themselves that I would call up and say, "Would you give me an interview?" would say, "Yeah, I'd love to have you come interview me about my work, but I don't think I'm a peacemaker." And my high school son said, "Mom, look, if you want them to identify themselves as peacemakers, ask them their definition of peace and ask them if they do anything that makes that happen." So those were my first two questions, because I had to get it squared away that they were, in fact, peacemakers by my definition. Mm-hmm. Then I asked them, "How did you find your work? What happened in your childhood that led you down this path instead of some other path? What role do you think forgiveness plays in peacemaking? Did you have an event that, or a prominent person in your life that catapulted you this way?" I would ask them to describe for me a picture of what the world would look like. I wanted their words to describe the world that we would see if their idea of peace was in effect right now. I asked them, "What advice would you give to someone that wanted to become a peacemaker?" Those were the core questions that I asked them.
Mm-hmm. And when you asked those questions, what did you learn from them? Obviously, here you got all of these interviews. There must have been some principles or thematic things that showed up, patterns and so forth. What did you learn?
Well, I have to say, in the middle of every interview, I was so blown away by their answers. I just was learning what Sister Mary had to say, or Shahala. But when I backed off and had some time to transcribe all of these interviews and then take a look at them across the board, I did find a set of ways that they went about their work that was pretty common across the thing. And it actually becomes chapter 17 in the book. It's like the principles for success for a peacemaker. And they were things like, be awake when the opportunity comes along, like never give up your goal, but never get attached to how you get there. Like no violence ever, including to yourself. Like if you get stuck because everybody's telling you what you can't do, figure out one thing you can do and then do the next right thing. So there were 24 of those, and those are in 2 pages in chapter 17 in the book. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is I took the answers the women gave me to what would you tell someone that wanted to become a peacemaker? For instance, the clan mother up at Standing Rock that I interviewed, her answer to that question was, tell them to go find an elder. So they've got 2 chapters in the book that talk about what's to be learned from these women besides the total entertainment of their stories.
Well, I'm sure people want to know, like, delve into a couple of the people you interviewed. Give us a little bit of a sense of who they were and what you learned from them. I know you actually visited these people. You went to Standing Rock, and you share some of your experience and maybe give us a little more insight into who some of these women were and are.
Okay, so well, I'll give you two or three here. One would be the woman from Rio de Janeiro who works with the street kids. Mm-hmm. I ended up meeting her in New York City because she had a daughter that was going to graduate. So her daughter was in on the interview, which was really robust for the interview itself. And she talked about working with the street kids, the favela kids. And one of the things she said to me that blew me away was she said, so let me explain. The street kids are the ones that have run away from home and are setting up housekeeping, if you would, out on the streets, and they are always they are exploited by the drug lords. They're the ones that deliver the drugs or do some of the things. And if they screw up, the drug lords come to where they're living and they shoot them, they kill them. And they didn't have any chance for education. A lot of them were hooked on drugs. They didn't have any awareness. They didn't have any attention span to learn. So Yvonne learned how to work with these kids. And she told me the very first thing she had to do with these kids was teach them that they existed. And I went, what? So, and briefly, the way she did that is she would take a kid out into the street and hold up their hands together like this and go like, I am someone. So another person that I talked with was Alyssa Montanti, who's in Staten Island, and she had a horrible 4 years of anxiety attacks. And what drew her out of her anxiety attack was trying to think about the kids in the Bosnian War. And she got notice of one kid that had both hands and a leg blown off by a landmine. And helping that kid pulled her completely out of her anxiety attack. And she now has an organization that puts prosthesis, new eyes, all sorts of things for kids all over the world. She brings them to Staten Island, and the Shriners do free services for prosthesis and things like this.
Right.
I'll tell you one, and then I'll tell you something that happened to me with one of the women.
Sure.
There's Sister Mary, who was working with the Maasai in Tanzania. And she began to realize that even though the state of Tanzania, the country of Tanzania, required education for every child, the Maasai kids just didn't have access. They were nomads. So they didn't have teachers, they didn't have schools. So the girls just never got educated. I mean, 2% of the Maasai girls got educated. She started a center in Arusha and brought the girls to her and prepared them for the school system that was there. Often she'd have to go, she'd sneak in, she'd get a request from a Maasai mom that said, please come get my daughter. I don't want her to grow up with the same exact life I did. I want something better for her. Sister Mary would drive in her Range Rover at night. The mother would put the daughter in the car, and Sister Mary would drive away because the next day the daughter was supposed to get married. And sometimes the wife would get punished by the father because he was going to miss out on his dowry. But Sister Mary took the girls back. She teaches them the language they need for education. They need Swahili, they need English. She taught them how to live in the world safely. She has now educated, probably over 500 Maasai girls. And a lot of these girls go back and become teachers in their villages.
That's beautiful. One of my friends started an organization called the Unstoppable Foundation, and she's building schools in the Maasai region and educating girls. And
it's so needed. Oh,
yeah. And I wrote a book once called You've Got to Read This Book. And I interviewed people, what's the one book that changed your life? And the congresswoman from my district said it was a book about the fact that if you wanted to make a difference in Africa, the best dollar you could spend was to educate young girls.
That's right.
So, yeah, fascinating.
I think that's what Sister Mary threw. She she banked on that. That's what she did with her thing. And I will tell you one more thing, Jack, that really affected my whole work in this peacemaking thing, which is in chapter 3, there's a woman who set up a camp for Bosnian refugee kids. The war had just barely ended. And these kids had barely made it through the war. And she collected them and got a bunch of American volunteers, of which I was one, and took us to an island where these kids had 2 weeks of a safe place to play, the first in 4 years that they'd had. And I was in charge of little 10-year-old boys. They weren't so little because now they were the head of their household, because every male over 11 in Srebrenica was killed in front of these kids' eyes or taken away to be killed. Their moms were raped. And then we had a bunch of the kids were from Sarajevo, where their whole beautiful city had been devastated. And when we finished having this camp for these kids, oh my God, by the end of 2 weeks, these kids could play together. They could do big sports, which they never could do during the war. They could dance. We had a dance every night that was hilariously fun for all of us. And then they kind of closed back again to go back to their refugee camps and cities. And they said, would you please come with us? We want you to tell the world what happened to us, because we don't think they knew. Because if they knew, why did they let the war go on for 4 years? And when I got back from that experience, all of a sudden, well, the first thing I wanted to do was just hold my kids for about 3 days. And then I said to myself, you can't pretend this is an academic exercise anymore. You have got to do something about this. You've got to be a conscious, acting peacemaker yourself. And while you're at it, why don't you wake up as many conscious, acting peacemakers as you can? And that's the chapter 18 in the book that you spoke of. This is asking the reader or the listener, because I recorded the audio, to take on an act of peacemaking, write about it, and send it in to me, because I'm still collecting peacemaker stories.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I just wish you great success. I wish we had a 3-hour program right now. I could talk to you for hours. You have amazing experiences. And I think one of the things that I love about your book is it takes us on that journey into these places that many of us would never know about if you hadn't done this. And there's these unsung heroes, if you will, but all of us have the potential to be that kind of a hero in whatever community we live in, whatever way we can do it, however small or however large we're called to do it, to become intentional peacemakers. So if people want to learn more about your book, about this topic, about the invitation you're issuing to people to become a peacemaker and to share that with you, where do they go? How can they find out more?
Well, if they walk into a bookstore, this book is bright yellow, so it's really easy to find, and it's got the pictures of the 15 women on the front. If they are at home, they can go to my website. It's barbechamblisauthor.com.
Very good.
And they can order the book right off that, and they can also order the audiobook off faraway places. So right on the website.
Very good. Very good. Well, as I said, I regret having to bring this to a close, but thank you so much for joining us, Barbe. I encourage all of you listening to take advantage of this and really go check out this book and really become peacemakers, because as you do this, not only are you going to uplift other lives, you're going to be uplifted in the process. So once again, thanks for joining us today, Barb.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jack. Bye-bye.
I so appreciate your time and your willingness to make a commitment to make a difference. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today as well. I strongly encourage you to get a copy of the book, as I said. And also, please make sure to tune in next week, where I'll have another person who's committed to helping you make a better you, make your life better, make the world better, and we all can live in greater harmony, greater joy, greater abundance, and greater peace. So until then, take good care of yourself.